Hi Derek, welcome to our Russ Johnson tribute. Look, the question that I first asked John Mower and Graham Goebel, which I'll ask to you, is do you remember how you first met Russ?
Well, I met the whole three of the guys at the same time. I mean, the situation was that I'd sort of, after 3 or 4 years of intense sort of activity in the music business from when I was sort of, a young teenager, I sort of came back to Melbourne and was living with my mum and dad, sort of taking a break from the music business, and I was working as a salesman at the In Shop, which was a clothing store that was around, the end of the 60s, beginning of the early 70s, and it was, I think Sanity Records are in there now, I'm not sure, it was in Burke Street, opposite Myers, and I was working in there, upstairs on the mezzanine, and Beeb Birtles came in, and I think he came in looking at clothes because we didn't know one another very well. Beeb had been a lot more successful than I had been in the Zoot, of course.
But did you know who he was?
Well, certainly, because, I knew his face very well because those guys got lots of publicity and the little bands I'd been in certainly didn't, so I kind of felt we were in different leagues and I was pretty flattered when he came in and I don't remember whether he actually had the Mississippi album with him at the time, but we certainly spoke about it, and talk about fate. It was amazing because here's a couple of guys who never really hung out with one another, and I don't think maybe had even met one another fleetingly, and he's telling me about this band that he'd been involved with and had sort of just joined, and had I heard about them? And I said, no, I hadn't. I think I may have heard their single, Kings of the World, on the radio, because it was quite a hit.
So he knew who you were?
Well, yeah, which was kind of interesting. Look, thinking about it more now, John Brownrigg actually hired me, and of course you and your listeners would know John Brownrigg perhaps from The Sect, if I'm correct, a Brisbane-based band. And so perhaps even, and I'm just kind of, trying to get through my cloudy memory, maybe Bee popped in to see John or something like that. I would imagine that he probably would have bumped into John more often because I think The Sect were quite popular as well and were doing quite well. But either way, I was just in the right place at the right time, to use a cliche. And Beeb told me about this album. And I think, to use his words, were that as soon as he put this album on and heard it, he knew he had to be a part of this. And I don't know, as I said, whether he gave me a copy of the album at that first meeting or whether he came back in and gave me a copy. And it had the same effect on me. I mean, I went home and I had never heard an Australian recording like that. It immediately reminded...
I don't think there'd been one like that yet.
Well, yeah, it immediately reminded me of America, I mean, it was that same, 3 guys, 3 voices, great kind of acoustic, unplugged kind of approach to the music. And it was just absolutely fantastic. And so, to get to the crux of your question, I remember that we set up a rehearsal at the house that I don't know if it was actually, it may have been Russell's house that he was living in with his wife Clemene at the time, and it was over in sort of the Hawkesburn...
Oh yeah, I think Graham mentioned Auburn, could that be right?
Auburn, that's correct. It may have been on Auburn Road or just near Auburn Road, but, it was just a little family home, and we went in there, and I took my drums, and we set up in the front room, the front bedroom, that had all the stuff cleared out. And so, I met everyone at the same time. And the thing that also struck me was that their music sounded like it was in that genre of America, but the guys looked like they'd stepped straight out of the band, as in Rag Mama Rag up on Cripple Creek, the band, because they all had beards. And, so they kind of looked very sort of, they had this rustic, or this sort of like Cajun, or I don't know, whatever, Blue Ridge Mountain kind of look about the guys. So, the whole thing, was just something quite special. I thought these guys look kind of different to anyone else I've ever played with before, and they certainly sound like it. So, I remember shaking all their hands and meeting them all at the same time. I don't believe that I met any one of them before the other, except from when I first walked into the room.
So who was, there was Graham...
There was Graham
Russ,
Goebel and
John
Mower and Russell Johnson, and Beeb was there, of course. Now, Beeb, I think, had originally been approached because they knew he could sing, and I think they approached him because they needed a bass player. And I think that, Beeb would be the first to admit that, his bass playing wasn't up to the caliber of what they needed for that kind of band, and certainly to the caliber of the bass playing that had been played on the record, because the bass on the record, I do believe, was played by Barry Sullivan. Was an astonishing bass player. And so, but when they heard Beeb's voice, they were just so rapt to hear Beeb's voice and how it blended with theirs. that Beeb sort of switched to acoustic/electric guitar. So I don't know if Beeb actually played bass at that first rehearsal, or whether we had a bass player at the time. I got to apologise for being a bit foggy on that. But I remember that my drumming and my drums were a bit loud for them, and I think maybe 10 or 15 minutes into the sort of first sort of part of the rehearsal, we hastily went out and got some tea towels and stuff and had to put them on my drums because, you know, I'd been used to playing with kind of heavy metal cover bands and bands that were doing things by like Black Sabbath and Jethro Tull, so I wasn't used to a light touch, you know, as I said, a sort of an acoustic/unplugged kind of band, and so it was quite a disciplined thing for me to go through. But I do remember that at that sort of rehearsal or audition, I think I passed the first phase. I guess it was kind of almost like an Australian Idol now, to make a strange comparison, because I think I remember that the next time we got together, we actually assembled at Studio One at Metropolis Studios in Bank Street, South Melbourne, which was where we went on to make just about all of our records. So it was a very important place in our career. I think I didn't realise it at the time, but I think I was being put through sort of rehearsal part 2, because I remember we put microphones on the equipment, and we had another run through or a jam or a blow, and I went home and I sort of found out later that the guys kind of, you know, isolated the drums and really checked me out to see if I could cut the mustard recording on that kind of level. So I'm quite flattered now that I sort of passed the audition, especially because I think I'd only done one recording at that stage of my career, and that was with a band I was in called The Ash, and we recorded a song called Midnight Witch. So, you know, it was very, very special, and I knew I was becoming involved in something, you know, quite special, and I knew that I was going to kind of have to lift my game a lot, you know, which was a fantastic experience to know you have to push the boundaries, you know, yourself.
Well, at that time, it would have been Russ and Graham sharing the composing duties. So did Graham say, oh, this is my song, you do it this way, or did Russ go and say, this is my song, you do it this way? Was there any sort of...
No, I think it was like that. Yeah. I think it was sort of a bit sort of Lennon and McCartney-ish in that way. Mm-hmm. If the boys don't mind the comparison, well, if Graham doesn't mind the comparison, I'm sure
they've already compared themselves to him, so it doesn't matter.
Well, there you go. But look, one thing I do remember, I was thinking about this before your call, trying to sort of, you know, go through my brain for any little anecdotal stuff, and I do remember that I've always kind of had an interesting kind of a bond with lead guitarists. Not to say that, you know, I haven't had an affinity with bass players, because that's the sort of tried and true role. The cornerstone of a rhythm section is its bass player drummer combination. But I remember that I'd always kind of had this thing with guitar players where I think guitar players loved the fact of having a blow with a drummer, because they weren't restricted by kind of, you know, keys or chords or whatever. They could just play and go wild. And I remember that whether it was before or after a couple of rehearsals, Russell and I had a couple of these blows where we just kind of really went for it, and it was just a fantastic experience. And I remember that some of the times those rehearsals were more kind of memorable, or those moments with Russell were more memorable than the rehearsals themselves, as far as, you know, just extending oneself. And that's the thing I got from Russell. I mean, I really got that, you know, Graham was a fantastic songwriter and a great putter togetherer of material. He knew exactly what he wanted, and he knew the harmonies he wanted, and he pretty much heard the finished song, which of course he continued doing right on through Little River Band, of course. But the thing with Russell was he was just a lot more kind of organic and let's go with the flow and let's find that magical feel. He was more ready to have perhaps the other musicians' input than Graham was. You know, Graham sort of knew what he wanted, and he would sort of delegate often parts, and then he would leave it up to the musicians to kind of refine those parts or extend them. But with Russell, you know, he was great in that respect. You know, he'd just play, and he'd say, "What do you think? You know, what do you think it needs here, or whatever." So he was great. And I got to say here that I deeply regret that I didn't spend more time with Russell. I mean, in the sense that our time as musicians playing together was very limited because of the circumstances turning out as they did, which probably Graham, talked about a lot more in detail. But but he was a very, very special guy and a very special guitar player and musician. And I wish that we'd have spent more time with Russell, and we would have had more of a career with him. It's a great shame.
Yeah, well, that's life, as they say.
Yes, it is. But as I said, I'm looking forward to hearing the things that Graham has said, because he obviously spent a lot more time with Russell. As I said, Graham probably spent, would it have been years?
Well, he spent a lot of time creating those songs, so...
Exactly,
yeah.
Exactly. So I just wish I could have got to know the guy and had have recorded with Russell. That would have been a wonderful experience, which unfortunately, was robbed from us.
Well, anyway, Derek, we've run out of time.
Okay.
Thanks very much sharing your reminiscences regarding Russ and a tribute to Russ Johnson's show. So once again, thanks, Derek Pellicci.
Okay, my pleasure, Nick.